Yeah, I think for energy, they're targeting distributed energy resources. So things like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, EV chargers, which are also inherently distributed and decentralized. It's literally in the term of distributed energy resource. And again, I think like there is a large advantage to DePIN in terms of like people can take on the costs on real estate that they own. It's not solar panels are a bit more than a $500, BMO type device, but still feasible. They can get the financing. It's doable on a more individual level. So I think a lot of it is just to be distributed hardware works well with distributed infrastructure deployment models, which is DePIN. And I think, I don't know if there's something intrinsically true about that relationship, but that's just what I've noticed.
Okay, welcome. This pod is a part of the series we are doing for the 2025 edition of the Messari thesis. DePIN is one of my favorite crypto sectors, and Dylan Bane has embraced the sector since he joined us as an analyst earlier this year, following in the footsteps of Sami Kassab, Messari alumni, and the godfather of DePIN. So big shoes to fill, and he's done a phenomenal job covering the sector this year. And like Sami did, being early covering key protocols and sector narratives. So excited to have you both on the pod.
Thanks, Maartje. I love that tagline, by the way. Godfather of DePIN. I'll
Yeah, I
take it.
didn't make that up. I heard that somewhere, and I liked it. And I think it's
Streets are talking.
yeah. So let's start. I'll briefly introduce myself, and then let's start with intros from you guys. So I am Maartje. I am VP of Research at Messari. So Sami, you're the guest, so you get to go next.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Currently, I'm a partner at Crucible Labs, which is a Bittensor focused firm. But I actually got into crypto through Messari, and I spent about 2 years on the enterprise team there. Initially focused on DePIN, and then towards the end of my time there, focused on AI. And I miss every day being there, just surrounded by all the good vibes and the great team. But yeah, so focused on Bittensor, but I've still been monitoring DePIN on the side, and I'm excited to be here and catch up and discuss everything that's happening in the sector.
Didn't you start in the hub, Sami?
Yeah.
I know, right? Oh man, that seems like a million years ago. Dylan, over to you.
Hey guys, I'm Dylan. I'm a current research analyst on the enterprise team, mostly covering DePIN now. Prior experience in asset management, startups, VC, focusing pretty deep on RWAs and infrastructure, and now I like DePIN the most.
That's awesome. Okay, so Dylan, let's start with you giving us a high level overview of what you covered in this year's thesis.
Yeah, so I think DePIN had a great year. I think some would call it a breakout year, but both in terms of market performance and then real world traction. So we see the market cap up over 130% year over year. We see early stage fundraising also up a ton at 130 or over 300%. So a lot more funding, a lot more capital flowing into DePIN. And I think what's partly driving this, obviously, this is crypto, so there's a lot of factors, but is real world traction. So we see protocols like Helium that launched Helium Mobile in December of 2023, and they've grown to over 120,000 subscribers over the last year. They've also launched a carrier offload program where they partner with the top largest telecom providers in the US to basically take on coverage in areas where they don't have coverage for their subscribers so far. And we're seeing other DePINs do that as well for protocols like XNet. And then we're seeing also a lot of real world traction from the energy sector. I think Glow was kind of a standout story this year. So grew to over 70 solar farms from California to India. They generated over 1.7 million kilowatt hours of energy. And they've generated arguably the most revenue in DePIN, depending how you look at their on-chain revenue, at over 25 million. And then other areas I'll highlight are RTK stations, so protocols like GeoNet. They've managed to build the world's largest real-time kinematics network. I can get deeper into that later, at over 11K nodes. And that's larger than the second largest network, which is from Trimble, large $15 billion public corporation, which has about 5K nodes. So we're seeing real world traction deepen infrastructure networks that weren't previously possible. We're also seeing some very mainstream collaborations. So GeoNet, for example, partnered with the US Department of Agriculture to provide high-level, like exact precision farming. Obviously, Helium and other networks like XNet have partnered with the largest telecoms. Demo and other protocols have also integrated pretty deeply with Tesla. So we're seeing, real world, largest institutions kind of integrating with DePIN, and this is something we expect to grow in the coming years. So a lot happened in DePIN. I touched on wireless and energy. I think other sectors worth highlighting are compute. So these are mostly GPU compute networks. We've seen probably over 30 emerge this year, just basically offering lower priced compute compared to centralized providers like AWS. This is really kind of helping drive, I guess, the AI kind of revolution is benefiting a lot from this. A lot of AI startups, especially focused on crypto, can take advantage of this lower cost compute. There are questions about differentiation and how sustainable the model is for a lot of these DePINs. That's definitely been one of the more standout sectors. We've seen protocols like Render appreciate a lot to over 5 billion. We've seen IO.net, Ether, Nosana emerge with over 100 million market caps. So that's been one of the bigger stories in DePIN. We're seeing also a lot of experimentation on the content delivery network side. So networks like Pipe and Blockcast receive pretty high profile VC funding. They're taking novel approaches to basically reduce latency by creating hyper localized nodes, especially in the developing world. Blockcast is using a multicast approach, which is not very utilized, but might be more feasible using a DePIN model. So we'll see where that goes. And then Pipe is focusing on on increasing points of presences, POPs as they call it, to also increase or decrease latency and just make streaming and other content delivery more efficient. And yeah, I could keep going, but I think manufacturing is interesting, seeing protocols like 3DOS, you basically DePIN for 3D printing, where you can submit an order in hours and have it printed locally using a DePIN network, which I think is a novel use case, pretty interesting. We might be able to see more on the manufacturing front and more larger scale industry as well in the coming years. Also robots, and just creating robotic fleets. A lot of these are like RWAs that you can gain a share in their profits. So if like you have like a robotic coffee maker in an airport, you can like get a share in that as an RWA. And the idea is that this can evolve into DePIN by contributing these machines to the network and just building this out quicker. So there's a ton more examples. I think I'll probably stop there for now, and we can go into some the more specific sectors later.
Okay, cool. One of the questions that I wanted to start with, right? Like I remember that back in 2022, when the early 22, you joined us, right? And you started covering some of these DePIN protocols. I remember early reports on, for example, Helium and Akash probably, and Render. At that point in time, I think Multicoin comes to mind as a VC that had already invested there and may have at least started to piece some things together. But I think I credit you with being the first one to first very effectively frame it and map it out and put it on the map. Like how I thought it would be fun to ask you how you pieced that all together back then, and what stood out to you.
Yeah, when I tell this story, I like to point out immediately that I don't take all the credit for creating DePIN. I built on the work of a lot of really intelligent people and firms. So 3 firms that come to mind, you just named Multicoin. They were, in my opinion, really kind of the leaders or the true pioneers of DePIN. But they weren't calling it DePIN at the time. They were calling it proof of physical work. There was another firm called Borderless Capital. They had their own little term for it called EdgeFi. And then Lattice Capital was also experimenting or exploring this space, and they were calling it
TPIN or something?
TIPIN, that's what it was. Yeah. So token incentivized physical infrastructure networks. And so as I got deeper, and what I noticed too is every one of these firms defined this sector differently. They included different types of projects, like some considered digital resource networks to be part of DePIN, others didn't. And as I started getting deeper, I was having more conversations with all these firms, and I was telling them that like we needed to all align on one term in order to get the whole community to sort of rally around it. And if we wanted DePIN to actually have a chance to catch on, whether it was not even mainstream, but like within the crypto community, we needed this alignment. And funnily enough, like it was much more difficult than I thought to get all these firms aligned, because obviously like everyone wants the firm that they chose to be the one that sticks. So I remember I was chatting internally actually with like Stephanie Dunbar. She was on the enterprise team. And I was like, all right, let's just think of some names and then let's just put it out there. So she actually helped, and we both thought DePIN sounded really good. And it goes back to the 2022 theses where we still didn't have this like official name. And Selkis at the time, like I remember I had a comment in the thesis report. I was like, oh, all these firms are calling it something different. I kind of want to call it DePIN. And he was like, fuck it, we're going to meme DePIN into existence. And seriously, like after that day, DePIN actually blew up like in a positive way. And so I credit him a lot to like the category getting to where it is today. He was like a major contributor there.
He credited himself the next year too, because he was calling himself out on it. Like, oh yeah, I put it on the map.
Yeah, I remember like something clicked for me when I saw him posting about it on Twitter. I was like, okay, I think this has a high chance of actually sticking. So I went and I bought DePIN.eth. I was like, just in case like it actually sticks, I want this domain. But yeah, so obviously like I credit a lot of the help of the team as well, and just packaging everything together, physical and the digital side. I'm really glad to see Dylan, leading the charge. I think he's doing a better job than I did, honestly. So yeah, major shout out to Dylan for his coverage.
Yeah. So okay, cool. That's a great story, Dylan. Let's talk a little bit about DePIN's breakout year, right? It was one of the success stories this year, like you mentioned in the intro. Why was 2024 the year of DePIN, right? Why was the breakout this year, and why now?
Yeah, I think it's a confluence of factors. So one, a lot of these protocols were very early stage in previous years. And so some have like come to market, grown out their network more, especially protocols like GeoNet. Glow was very early stage last year. A lot of these the newer compute ones kind of came to market this year. So we're just seeing protocols that have been talked about a lot in previous years finally just launch and make good initially on their promises. We've also seen the more established players also launch kind of long planned initiatives. So like Helium's Helium Mobile really took off this year. It's been built behind the scenes for I think a couple years now. I think we're seeing, a lot of progress more on the technical side from protocols like Render, Filecoin as well. So a lot of the just building quietly in the bear market before has just come to realization in 2024. So I think that's the first factor. I think the second is because of the bear market, there is a lot more interest in utility and real world value. And DePIN is probably the best sector in crypto that has that potential, or the highest potential sector. So I think they got a lot of attention when things were quiet, when markets were down. DePIN got a lot of attraction. I think that's kind of gave it fuel for getting a lot of mind share in 2024 when not a lot was happening. So I think it's all those factors coming together that have just given it a breakout year.
So let's talk a little bit about Helium, right? Being one of the success stories of the year. I remember when I first joined Messari like 4 years ago, there was always like this running joke how Jack Purdy in the years prior put like hotspots in everyone's apartment and was just collecting these Helium tokens. And then Sami, you covered it in early 2022, and then later that year you wrote, I still love that title, The Telecom Cowboys of the Decentralized Wireless Movement. Now, I'm what has the evolution of Helium been, right? As an early pioneer in obviously in the DePIN sector. Yeah, and what has made them successful? Maybe Sami, maybe you start with a more like historical perspective, and then maybe Dylan, you can chime in talking about it more what we've seen this year in particular.
Yeah, would love to. I really do think that Helium is one of these, or almost should be considered the pioneering project within DePIN. And one thing they did really well was built hardware that was very affordable, which enabled anybody to purchase it and contribute to the network. So that was the first thing that they did really right. Two, I think what benefited them was transitioning from a single purpose network where back then they were strictly focused on IoT use cases to a platform or like a network of networks where now they can expand to 5G, 6G when it comes out, Wi-Fi, and whatever other wireless technologies they decide to. So I think that was a very, very smart move on their end. They've done a really good job maintaining and like building the community. If you look at a lot of other DePINs, it's really only the foundation that's moving things forward. Dylan, you probably know what I'm going to say here, but if you go into the Discord channel, you'll find all types of people contributing, whether it's like hardware manufacturers or professional deployment companies themselves. And I think that's actually attributed a lot to Helium's success. And then the last thing that I'll bring up is their focus, or I guess, yeah, their focus on building like a consumer end product for their network. Because a lot of these DePINs at the time were building out this infrastructure and then just, waiting for some company to come build like a application or some front end on top of their network. And Helium understood that they had to do this first in order to like demonstrate to people what was possible. And that's why they came out with Helium Mobile, which has had pretty high degree of success, honestly, with like 120K mobile subscribers, I believe. So yeah, I feel like it was a couple factors, but I'm curious, Dylan, if you would attribute anything else.
Yeah, I think I'd reiterate a lot of what you said. So Helium's also just been around for a very long time. I think it was founded 2014, mostly as an IoT network to start. I think you learn a lot of lessons in those 10 years. They managed to raise a massive war chest of, I think, over 400 million for Nova Labs in that time. So I think that gave them a massive advantage when they were shifting their attention to mobile. More quiet bear market to just have the resources and capabilities to do that. So yeah, I think community expertise, a lot of capital to throw at this. And, Helium's also just performed well historically. It did have a significant drop in the HNT price. I think they managed to navigate through challenges. I think the dual token design was a little questionable. They recently kind of got rid of it with HIP 138. Now it's basically fully focused on HNT. So I think just progressively also adapting and learning from their lessons has also helped. So I think all those factors have positioned Helium where they are now.
Yeah, and then what's you touched upon their mobile carrier offload program. Both of you mentioned obviously the 120,000 plus or so users of the of their mobile plan. What is so interesting to me is that this is touching the real world both through that carrier offload program and that plan, right? And it's like it's real world adoption from both users and Web 2. And from the user's perspective, also, a lot of it is like under the hood, right? It's kind of like abstracted away. Yeah, it would actually be interesting, Dylan, if you could talk a little bit more about that carrier offload program and what that means. I think that will be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah, we did a whole podcast with the head of carrier offload at Helium and some of the other top people. So basically, it's how it works is you have a major carrier. Like a lot of people don't know this, but in the 5G era, telecom companies have struggled to expand coverage. So basically, before we had like large towers that were efficient to distribute in like the 3G era, 4G era to some extent, but now you need smaller cells, basically these smaller receptor type infrastructure that needs to be distributed like every couple hundred feet. That's very expensive to deploy because you need real estate and you need permitting and you need operational costs to install it. And I think DePIN kind of just comes in at the right time here, especially on wireless, where you can deploy these Helium hotspot type devices much more easily. So for large telecoms who want to expand faster or to more areas, it's easy to take advantage of Helium, which has lower capex for deploying these. So yeah, I think in terms of stats, Helium supporting somewhere between 250 to 300,000 subscribers a day. And they really just launched in September. So that's a lot of growth, very fast. And they're partnering with the very largest telecoms. They can't disclose the names, but you can think of the big three. They're also not the only DePIN doing this. So XNet also is partnering with the very largest telecoms. They're doing a similar carrier offload program. I think other DePINs could come in as well. And I think this is probably among the largest markets the DePIN can address, both domestically in the US and globally, just because everyone wants faster internet. And technologies like Starlink are not going to evolve fast enough to be cheap all over the world. And you're going to need, helium hotspots basically, or other DePIN type radio systems to expand internet coverage.
And one of the things that you said is that you expect that we may see some of those DY integrations with Starlinks as early as next year, right?
Yeah, Helium's definitely in talks with Starlink. So a lot of people think like, oh, Starlink's just going to disrupt everything. But the issue is that each node's going to be pretty expensive and the costs aren't going to reduce a lot in the near term. So if you're in a remote area, it makes more sense to just have one Starlink base station on Earth connecting to the satellite and then using a bunch of hotspot type devices to spread that out to the adjacent area. So Helium's thinking about it. I know Dawn, which is another big wireless DePIN that launched this year. They're also, I think the founder visited Ghana recently, and they're planning to partner with Starlink or integrate with Starlink to expand to more rural parts of Ghana. Actually, what's like kind of interesting is that the internet infrastructure in the capital cities of places like Ghana are very robust and well developed. It's just getting it out to the rural areas. So DePIN's actually a great solution to this. And I think Starlink and DePIN just kind of coalesce very well.
Yeah, on that same note, Dylan, have you heard of a project called SpaceCoin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't really like looked in too deeply, but it sounds like a decentralized Starlink. And I remember like no shade to the team, but I was looking through their pitch deck and they mentioned how much underutilized satellite bandwidth there is out there. And in my head, I was like, oh yeah, my satellite's just out there, in orbit and it's underutilized. So I would love to put it to work in a DePIN network. But it sounds like it's an actual legit project. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah. So the way they work is they have to use a SpaceX rocket to launch into space and then deploy their own satellites. It sounds kind of crazy, admittedly. Like it's called SpaceCoin, like reminds me of like Space Force, but they have like very legit people behind it. They're like US generals involved. It's a very interesting project. I don't know how fast they can realistically scale, and like the economics are a bit unclear. Like we'll have to see how this first launch works. And I don't know how needed they are. Like I guess you can apply the method, but I would guess given how many satellites are actually launching into space and how capital intensive this is, like a centralized model makes a lot more sense. But I think it's definitely interesting, and I'm glad like they're pushing the frontier, and yeah, we'll see where it goes.
It's actually a great segue to another question that I wanted to ask you guys, right? Like where does DePIN work well, right? Compared to like centralized models?
Yeah, I can start. I think first is when the infrastructure really needs to be distributed and the actual infrastructure isn't like super high cost in terms of capital expenditures. So I think GeoNet is a good example. So founder GeoNet has 25, 30 years experience in the satellite navigation industry. And he basically tried to deploy a centralized RTK network with global coverage. And what he found is that for every node that he would deploy, it would cost him 25K in terms of real estate costs, permitting costs, installation costs, and that would be very slow expansion to build out this network. But if you use a DePIN model, you can just get the person who owns the real estate to buy his station for $700. They handle installation, they take on all these OpEx costs, and you're basically paying $700 instead of $25,000 if you're trying to deploy this as a centralized company. And I think a lot of it's just geographical. So if you need to have tons of infrastructure distributed around the world, I guess maybe intuitively a decentralized deployment model makes more sense. And I think
like a hype mapper, for example,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like very location dependent. I think that might be one of the biggest advantages of DePIN.
I think you made a great point, Dylan, on, DePIN making a lot of sense when the hardware does need to be distributed, especially as AI continues to advance and more companies continue to integrate it. There's a bigger need for edge computing, as well as, CDN networks that are just moving basically the data closer to the end user. And so I think that's like a perfect use case for DePIN. And then in terms of the physical resource network side of things, anything that is as simple as having a user like plug and play that hardware, I think works really well. But when it gets as complex as having if this technology requires a lot of maintenance or is quite difficult to actually install and operate, then maybe a more centralized model makes sense. But I don't know. I mean, we were just talking about a space-based DePIN, and so if that's possible, then what isn't possible?
Well, and the same for a glow or so, right? That's also very specialized. So I don't know, Dylan, if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, I think for energy, they're targeting distributed energy resources. So things like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, EV chargers, which are also inherently distributed and decentralized. It's literally in the term of distributed energy resource. And again, I think there is a large advantage to DePIN in terms of people can take on the costs on real estate that they own. It's not, solar panels are a bit more than a $500, demo type device, but still feasible. They can get the financing. It's doable on a more individual level. So I think a lot of it is just to be distributed hardware works well with distributed infrastructure deployment models, which is DePIN. And I think, I don't know if there's something intrinsically true about that relationship, but that's just what I've noticed.
Okay, well, let's talk about AI a little bit, or DePIN and AI. So, Sami, again, it seems like you were early to everything, but also an area where I remember where you were early to cover this in early 2023. We do have a separate pod on this, but so what I would like to focus in on here is where some of the areas where DePIN touches AI. So we'll start with decentralized compute, briefly touch on the data layers, and then I would like you guys to debate whether Bittensor is a DePIN or not, just for fun. So again, Sami, you covered Akash and Render in early 2022. Now the compute subsector has seen a huge surge in interest, obviously fueled by the rapid growth of generative AI, compute being the lifeblood. Valuations have gone up. There seems to be quite a lot of activity there, but I also understand that there are significant challenges in capturing demand there.
Yeah. So this has been a problem that compute networks have faced, ever since they launched. So I guess kind of to zoom out, there's this debate on whether or not even the compute networks should be considered DePINs. I find that kind of a waste of time, honestly. There is a physical hardware component. You could probably make the argument that every blockchain has a hardware component. But if you think about the location of this hardware mattering for latency purposes, then I think that sort of qualifies it as a DePIN. And for AI, location does matter because you're trying to reduce the latency as much as possible. So going back to your initial question on demand, This is something that has continued to surprise me. I've had a thesis for a while that these decentralized compute networks will eventually demand will eventually show up. But I've learned the hard way that just because you're more cost effective doesn't necessarily mean that demand is just going to all of a sudden appear. You have to offer like significantly improved services. At the same time, a lot of these compute networks aren't very reliable. On the supply side, nothing is really forcing these compute providers to continue providing their resources. And the nature of just dealing with these distributed networks as well is that you could be, launching a workload on a server that's within someone's basement, for example, right? And there's no guarantee that it's going to stay online all throughout your training run or, whatever type of workload you're running. And honestly, I've been thinking about this a little bit more because, 2 years ago, a lot of people thought decentralized storage was, here to stay or would eventually like have a lot of demand emerge for it. And to this day, we haven't seen that happen. And so I'm cautious about that same thing playing out for these decentralized inference networks where the consumer just doesn't care, right? Even if it's a little bit cheaper, people aren't incentivized enough to go integrate with these decentralized inference networks because again, decentralization isn't like a core priority for them. And we're seeing this play out, right, with all these AI agents. These are essentially applications and they're all running on centralized networks. So if I'm being completely honest, it's not looking good for these decentralized compute or inference networks, right? Like there's absolutely no demand at this point in time. There's no longer a shortage in GPUs. And so that's not necessarily a problem. And really, unless these centralized AI labs start cracking down on these crypto related companies using their services, or if the government comes in and like apply some type of regulation, I don't really see any catalyst that would force or like lead to a lot of these applications or users moving to these decentralized compute networks. So I know that's a really bearish take, but curious what you think on that, Dylan.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points. I think it's like unclear if like the juice shortage is really solved. Like we're gonna need more and more. Does like Nvidia's production like keep up with that? We assume it does. They have a lot of capital to do so, but not certain. And I'm sure within the grand scope of everything being developed in AI, there might be some specialized use case for these decentralized models. So I think like there is going to be demand in some capacity. I think my bigger concern is how this all plays out. So I don't see, hundreds of DePIN GPU networks competing to offer basically an undifferentiated commodity. So, I think it's going to consolidate within a few DePINs or maybe even a large AI company who's like, maybe we can get a slight edge in some way by creating our own DePIN and we can integrate it within our wider network. And that can kind of wipe out all of these other startups. So I think, yeah, demand not clear. I think they'll be there in the future, but I don't really see, or at least it's unclear to me right now, who wins and how all this is gonna play out.
So another essential to building powerful AI systems is data, and DePINs are emerging as a potentially critical solution to incentivize users to share data for AI model training. And Grass, has become one of the year's breakout DePIN projects. Dylan, can you explain, maybe taking Grass as an example, what is exactly the problem that we are solving for here, using Grass as an example?
Yeah, so Grass is basically trying to accumulate data to train AIs on the web. So it's kind of web scraping in some way, but they're giving an incentive to users to share their bandwidth to basically conduct these operations. So that it's not like that complicated of a model. It's really just how do you get people to basically hand over their excess data or bandwidth so that they can do this.
And the key here is that as a centralized company, it's harder to do that, right, than using individuals' bandwidth. Did I understand that correctly?
How it's done, how like the centralized model works is that there's these data scraping companies that partner with application, let's say like mobile apps. And they'll insert this software, like the data scraping software, into the background of these apps without these users really knowing about it. And so you could sort of make the argument that it's unethical because this is happening without really the consent of the user and they're not being compensated for it. So the grass model is a lot more ethical. It basically incentivizes people to like install this extension, and the extension is fairly easy to get set up. And then, people are basically rewarded for monetizing some of their idle bandwidth. So at the same time, like, yeah, I think you're able to reach a larger audience in terms of like your supply side providers doing this. And Grass, honestly, I think was the first project that successfully showed how like referrals work well within crypto. And they started with data scraping, and now they're moving on to annotating that data, which is also like a key process within the whole like data pipeline for training AI. And I think the idea there is kind of similar to what is happening within Hivemapper right now, where it's just like another set of workers that are, within Hivemapper, they're labeling what the imagery is showing, and so within Grass, they want people to do that same kind of exact thing, but just with general data.
Does that work well as a model, having the data annotation bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways that people can like game the system, right? Like you can develop bots, for example, to sort of just like spam attack the network. And I remember when I was talking with Ariel from Hivemapper about this, it was just this like constant cat and mouse game where they had to design systems that would be able to detect people gaming, the incentives and whatnot. But I think once you kind of like design something that's fairly robust, it could be pretty scalable and more scalable than the centralized model.
Okay, so let's move over to the fun question. Is Bittensor a DePIN?
The answer is sort of related to whether or not you think digital resource networks are a DePIN. And if you do agree with that, then yeah, Bittensor should be classified as a DePIN. Right now, all the subnets or applications on Bittensor are, digital resource networks. They're either focused on like compute or data, or even further than that, sort of like incentivizing intelligence or knowledge. But like one of my predictions for next year would be that you will have like a traditional physical resource network emerge on Bittensor. So I'm really looking forward to that. Again, I'm hoping it happens next year. But yeah, I think what led to me just becoming so tau-pilled was spending so much time within Bittensor. And then once I saw and understood Bittensor as this like incentive design system, it kind of clicked for me that like any type of DePIN could be built within this like platform. Yeah, which sort of just led me to spending all my time and dedicating my career basically to Bittensor.
Before we move just to Dylan's take, I also saw you tweet something you alluding to decentralized science in that context. Is that like a similar like rationale?
Yeah, I mean, there's already like a few DeSci projects within Bittensor. There's like one subnet that's doing protein folding. There's another one that's doing like neural architecture search. And so I think this just goes to show like anywhere that you can like, measure an output and like specify a specific output, like you can launch it as a subnet. And same thing within DePIN, right? Like if there's any sort of action that you can like quantify, then you can create this protocol that incentivizes people to provide it, whether it's physical or digital related.
Yeah, I think I have largely the same take as Sammy. Like, it would qualify as a digital resource network. And again, like we've talked extensively about how do you categorize DePIN, and I think like I kind of just said like we like an exact definition is ever gonna like quite apply that satisfies everyone. And I think a lot of the spirit of DePIN is just like provides real utility, provides real world value, kind of has some elements integrated deep in some way. And at this stage, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to really be very granular about the cutoff. And so I would consider Bittensor broadly as a DePIN, but I think it's a lot more than that as well.
Well, just a little plug before we move on. But if DeSci has been a pretty hot topic, so if you're listening and you're interested in that, we will be publishing an update on our 2023 DeSci report this month. So look out for that. So Dylan, you just spoke about real value, generating real world value. And revenue is obviously one measure of that. Sami, I remember when you first started, we were doing these Web3 revenue reports, right? And it wasn't really much to show, right? It was like maybe altogether it was 1 million or not even that was generated, and that seems to have substantially changed in 2024. Yeah. So Dylan, do you want to start with just repeating some of those numbers?
Yeah, so we've definitely seen an array of protocols getting into the seven-figure range for revenue. Glow, I think, annualized, or maybe actually this year has generated over 25 million. Helium's over 12 million. GeoNet's over 2 million. Protea's over a million. I think HiveMapper recently said that annualized they'd be doing 4.3 million based on recent burning. So we're seeing like 10 or so protocols hit the seven-figure range. I think maybe only Filecoin was arguably in that range, depending how you view revenue in prior years. So real revenues, real growth. I think we'll see a lot more growth in 2025, especially on the energy, from the energy sector and the wireless sector. So yeah, I think that helps validate. Again, it's not like a ton, like the revenue, the market cap ratio is still around 1,000x throughout DePIN. So, 40 billion plus market cap, maybe 50 million in revenue. So a lot of progress has to be made, but these are early stage businesses, and any venture backed business, it takes 5-10 years to create any meaningful revenue. So I think things are on the right track.
What has changed, right? Was one of the challenges historically like capturing that demand side, which never happened like very efficiently, and that's where some of the progress has been made? Is that like the reason?
Yeah, I think they're finally tapping into the demand side. So whether it's Helium Mobile or GeoNet or Glow, like they're actually buyers now. So yeah, I think Sami wrote a lot about demand side constraints. I think a lot of the kind of gateway company or foundation models where it's very centralized, they're like packaging these services and then selling it to wholesalers or through various distribution channels. They're finding a demand side, and they've learned from previous lessons.
One thing I'm curious to ask you, Dylan, is are these revenue numbers overall like protocol revenue, or is it like demand side revenue? Because when I think of a protocol like Grass, or not Grass, Glow, I feel like that number, that 25 million, comes from like the supply side, and which might be how for Glow, like revenue should be quantified. But I'm curious, like, do you put more like importance on demand side revenue, or do you think like that doesn't necessarily matter? You just want to look at protocol revenue because this is what at the end of the day matters for token holders.
Yeah, so I'd say broadly, like it's very different across the board how these DePINs categorize revenue and what they consider as revenue and what's on-chain revenue. And there's also off-chain revenue that's being funneled in, and there's burning. So it's hard to calculate exactly what's going on. For Glows specifically, so Sami's right, that is supply side revenue. I won't get into Glow's model since it's a bit complex. Most of that value is not accruing directly to Glow holders. Probably a fraction of that, 25 or so million. I think what it does indicate though is that revenue generates downstream carbon credits in the case of Glow, which are ultimately sold on the open market. So the more that supply side revenue grows, the more the demand side revenue grows. And I think the growth of Glow over the last year has been pretty remarkable for a DePIN. We're going to get a lot more demand side revenue. It's just, a fraction of what the Glow revenue is. And I'd say there are obviously questions about like, is that a little misleading? I think you can make the case that it is. I think it's more important to show that there's growth, that, there are real solar panels joining this network. Revenue is increasing. It is growing at a high rate. And I think down the road, we're going to be seeing much higher demand side revenues than we're seeing on the supply side right now.
Right. Yeah. Like an increase in supply side revenue, the way I would read that is like an increase in confidence from these people running like the solar panels, right? And without that, obviously, there's like this bootstrap phase within any DePIN where you need supply side to grow. And so the more operators, like solar farm operators that enter and are convinced that, okay, there's like real potential here. I'm willing to pay all these earnings up front to this protocol. Yeah, indicates confidence in the protocol. And I think you could apply that to all these other networks as well, like Filecoin, for example. I don't know the exact breakdown of like what percent of the revenue comes from the supply side, what comes from the demand side. But either way, like if you see that revenue continuing to increase, I don't think you have to overthink it that much. I'm talking to myself. You can just assume that or you can just read it as a positive sign.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Glow is not really demand side constrained. Like the market is there for like reliable carbon credits, and where they're at right now, they are not gonna outgrow the demand side. So as long as the supply side's growing and they're creating more verifiable energy, which can be certified as carbon credits, like that's real growth, that's real revenue. It's just going to come in later. So, again, like these are early stage businesses. I wouldn't get too caught up on exactly how much is accruing to token holders. Just like you don't pay dividends as a first year, second year startup. You probably don't make money, or like you're burning a ton of money, and down the road that equity is going to be generating real profitable dividends.
So, we talked about Glow here. In 2024, energy emerged as a very promising sector within DePIN. Dylan, you mentioned massive addressable market cap valued at over $21 trillion and an urgent global need to accelerate the clean energy transition. So what are some of the challenges that DePIN can help tackle here?
Yeah, so energy is a very complex industry. I think like without extensive background knowledge, it's hard to understand where DePIN really comes in. But I think there are two areas that I think it can make the most impact. One is in what I call DER coordination networks. So these are networks that are basically incentivizing people to connect their energy devices or infrastructure. So solar panels, batteries, EV chargers, maybe wind turbines down the road. And they connected these networks on chain, fully coordinated by a blockchain. And what this enables are on another layer, these things called virtual power plants and demand response programs, which basically help coordinate supply and demand on the. So we call it balancing the load, but making sure there's no shortage of energy when like solar panels don't generate as much energy at night. So like a big problem in energy is just all these energy resources don't have a continuous flow of energy like you would get from a centralized fossil fuel plant. So we need to adjust in real time to make sure there's no blackouts and there's no shortages, or there's not too much energy coming on and frying the grid. So you need to have real time insight into what's going on across these distributed energy resources. And because we're increasingly adopting clean energy and solar and wind and all that, we need to have this data. And this is like a massive problem right now that we're trying to solve in a centralized way. But it's difficult to incentivize people to connect their resources or their devices. Like you can maybe offer a discount or like some cash, but it's not necessarily all that compelling. And there's thousands of utilities and energy companies, and they all have these siloed off databases, and it's all done in Excel. Everything's not very well coordinated for the grid, which is very outdated itself in terms of its infrastructure. So we can bring in DePIN, we can incentivize people to connect their devices, provide that real-time data. And then cool thing with blockchain is it's easy to have unified standards. You can have all of these different companies, virtual power plants, just have the same standards on a blockchain. It's verifiable. It's much more easier to coordinate, basically. And this can help make the grid much more efficient and save potentially trillions of dollars in costs in the long run.
Let's first talk about what we think is going to happen with DePIN in 2025, and then we'd like to wrap up with some hot takes, some further out things. Dylan, do you want to start like maybe more in general, and then Sami, maybe you a little bit more focused on the intersection of AI and DePIN?
Yeah, so I had a few theses on DePIN, some probably more on the hot take side. First is I think DePIN will exceed 150 million in revenue in 2025. I think it's going to be driven mostly from wireless, energy, maybe on the mobility side as well. Right now it's about 50 million, so I'm projecting it can 3x in the next year. Second prediction, I think Helium HNT can become the largest market cap in DePIN next year. Right now it's around eighth or ninth. A lot of people push back saying doesn't have an AI narrative like something like Render has, and if you consider Bittensor as well. I think Helium has real world traction. It's only going to increase. I think the market is going to recognize that. I think it's relatively undervalued compared to other DPINs right now. Third prediction is I think we'll have a major government partnership or integration with DPIN in 2025. So we did see this with U.S. Department of Agriculture and GeoNet, but I expect an even larger integration. I think the administration is obviously very pro crypto coming in. David Sachs, new crypto czar, is a big investor in DePIN and Helium and Hivemapper and Solana. And I think there'll be some kind of integration somewhere between electricity, energy, AI, and crypto. DePIN intersection. We'll see that initiative. And then I think there'll be a rival that emerges to Solana as like the most popular place to build a DePIN. So Solana has been kind of the runaway success. Most protocols just default to building on Solana now, and a bunch have migrated over the last 2 years. I think either a native DePIN L1 like Peak or IoTex could start becoming a competitor, or something like Base, which has very strong UX, DevX, Coinbase's integrations and access to partnerships and distribution channels. I think we'll see one of those networks become a competitor to Solana and give it a run for its money. So yeah, those are some predictions I have for 2025.
Yeah, I think Dylan did a great job covering a lot of the general DePIN predictions. I think I'd agree with most of them. I can add a few that are sort of DePIN related, a few that are AI related as well. I think we're going to see a lot more data related DePINs emerge, whether these are more traditional data DePINs similar to like grass, but I think they'll be more hardware focused, where there's this one project, I'm forgetting the name, but they have these wearables that are collecting basically like different biometrics and health data, and then contributing that to a network where the intention is to monetize that data set. I guess that falls more into like the data DAO category, and Vana is a project that's working in that domain. But I anticipate that will take off a lot. It's sort of like the progression of the decentralized compute narrative, where it's like everybody has these really powerful hardware devices, whether it's a MacBook or a GPU. At the same time, everybody just has very valuable data. And I think developers are going to figure out, how to incentivize people to contribute it, especially as like data continues to be one of the limiting factors that is holding back continuous progress in foundational models. Another prediction I'd make is that we are going to see, similar to how we saw a surge of these GPU networks, I think we'll see a surge of distributed training networks emerge. And by the end of next year, I think a open source model will be produced from one of these distributed training networks that is with one of the models that say it, like if Meta is still open sourcing models by then, I think we'll see again the quality be at parity with what some of these centralized AI labs are producing. And I guess in terms of like a hot take, I'm bullish on the energy sector in terms of narrative. I think that's going to take off for sure. I do like Glow a lot. I'm very skeptical about these virtual power plant networks. I think people underestimate just how difficult it is going to be to reach a large enough scale in all these different localized areas. Because if you think about it, let's take like, Phoenix, for example, the amount of, or the number of contributors the network would need just in that local area to be able to make a dent on the power grid is going to be an insane amount of people. So like, I think the idea makes a lot of sense, but it could take like 10 years to see a protocol actually amass the amount of individuals, but also the actual like capacity to make a dent. So again, I think if anything, from what we've seen within DePIN is that these networks take a long time to reach maturity. And then even when they do reach maturity, it takes even a longer time than that to onboard customers or end users. So as like a DePIN investor, I think you just have to be very patient. And crypto folks are not patient at all. They're used to waking up and seeing their meme coin or AI agent up like 50%. So yeah, it requires a different type of mindset when you're investing in these DePIN networks, because at the end of the day, you're building real world value in the way where there's these valuable assets that are being distributed all over the world. And yeah, it's going to take time, but it remains a sector that I'm very bullish on.
So quietly collecting your demo coins or other coins, and then one day you'll wake up and
for a while, I've been farming those. Who knows? It might take another 5 years in order to see that really take off, or it'll go to zero. But either way, I'm prepared for either.
Yeah. Dylan, you're gonna get the final word. Any final hot takes?
Yeah, no, I think Sami brings up, I think, a pretty good point that DePIN is building real businesses, and real businesses aren't built overnight. So I think that's where things get very interesting, and that some people say, oh, if you're like investing in crypto for like meme coins or whatever, DePIN's off limits because there's cash flows and that you can build valuation models and all that. I actually don't think that matters to a crypto investor. I think they'll just ignore the cash flows if they're there, and then the real fundamental investors are just not going to touch DePIN. So I think you get this kind of weird zone that I don't know if we've really seen before, where you're building these real businesses that are going to have completely absurd valuations from a fundamental standpoint, and maybe they catch up in 10 years to that, but before that, it doesn't make necessarily a lot of sense, and that'll keep happening when the markets go up in a bull market, and then they'll go down in a bear market, and maybe you can get some attractive valuations, and then they'll go completely absurd again once again. So you have these crypto market type valuations for businesses that won't be worth that for 10, 20 years.
Okay, well, that was awesome. I'll just finish up with a final shill. If you want to stay ahead of the curve on DePIN, consider subscribing to Messari. I would say our DePIN coverage is second to none. We also cover a number of DePIN projects on the protocol services side of our business. So some of the protocols we talked about today, like Peak and Helium, amongst others. And these reports are free, and we provide quarterly coverage there. So with that, Sami, Dylan, thanks for joining and for sharing your wisdom. This was fun.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks, guys.